Welcome to Corona Stories from Observing the Process. I'm your host, Alex Greenberg. And before we start, I'm hoping you can help me out by supporting the show. You can do this by going to my website, observingtheprocess.com. For just $5 a month or $50 for the year, you can become a monthly supporter. This show relies on listener support to stay on the air. So if you find this content valuable, I hope you will consider subscribing. You can find a link to subscribe in the description of this podcast. If you can't support monthly, no worries. You can help out by rating and reviewing on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. You can share it with your friends, you can blog about it, or discuss it on your own podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you for supporting the show. Listeners like you make it possible. If you are looking for information on how to protect yourself and stay safe from COVID-19, please get information from the CDC or the World Health Organization. Today on the show, I had Camden Hauge. Camden runs several restaurants and is based in Shanghai, but is from America. Please welcome Camden Hauge.
In the land of China, people hardly got nothing at all.
No possessions?
And in China, they never go to church.
No religion too?
Or do magic.
Well, it's easy if you try, Dick.
Hey, Alex. Hi.
Hey, Camden, how are you? Thanks for taking the call.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. I can hear you just fine. You mentioned you were opening up a new shop. What's up with that?
Yeah. I thought I'd make lemonade out of Corona. We had some downtime because the other shops were closed. So a friend of mine and I were just chatting one day, thinking about what Shanghai needs in the city at the moment, and how, everyone wants to go to a cheap and cheerful new place that's interesting and kind of brand forward and a little bit swaggy. And so we were thinking about, what's a really fun, easy, but very high margin drink. And we were thinking like highballs. So based off of that general premise, we found this little shop on Fuminlu, which is really central. And we decided to extrapolate out into like a highball and konbini place. So konbini is like the Japanese convenience store vibe.
Awesome. You're always up to something.
Yeah. It was really funny because it came at just the right time. I'm really bad at downtime. So as soon as we closed, I was thinking, what am I going to do to keep myself busy and not think about the massive amounts of cash that are just hemorrhaging from our coffers every day that we're closed. And this was a really good distraction. So that was fun.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about it. So this whole conversation is kind of revolving around the coronavirus. So when did you first hear about it?
We first heard about it when we were up at my boyfriend's place in North China during I think it was the week before Chinese New Year. So it was just around the end of January, but things were still really new and kind of, I don't know, we didn't really take it seriously at the time. I think because his mom is really sweet but very protective, I thought that it was more of like she was just being protective of us, and that this was something that could never reach us or anyone else in the world. We heard that it was in Wuhan, but we didn't think that it would reach any of the major cities in China, let alone travel internationally. So we actually came back during Chinese New Year a couple days after we heard. And at that time, I realized, I think we had discussed very briefly whether or not we should come back at all. And the whole time I was thinking, of course we'll come back. Why wouldn't we be there? It won't be long ranging or, long lasting. And I want to be here when the shop's open. I want to be here for my team. And even a couple days after we heard about it, the airports were basically empty when we flew back. So that was as early as maybe the 26th of January.
Okay. Yeah, what's interesting to me is that for people who don't know, Chinese New Year is always a super dead time of the year where, Shanghai is pretty empty and most of these major cities are quite empty because people return to their hometowns. So I was almost thinking to myself, like, what kind of almost a good timing or horrible timing? I wasn't sure what to think for this kind of the thing to happen. Like when it was first happening, I was thinking, maybe this will happen. We'll just kind of die out because everyone's already not traveling too much, they're settled. But obviously that didn't turn out to be the case. So what was it like when you got back to Shanghai? I mean, did it felt like normal Chinese New Year where it's already dead and, kind of a little crazier, or what was that like?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because I was talking about that with a friend of mine who is abroad over in Europe. And we were saying that when we got back, as you say, everything's closed, everyone's traveled. On one hand, it was the worst time because everybody's traveling all around China.
Mm-hmm.
And as they love to quote, it's the largest mass human migration that happens. And it happens every year, right? So it's like millions and millions, billions of people are moving around China. So it's the busiest time for travel and therefore the most contagious time possible for anything to be moving around. But on the other hand, it was funny because we didn't really, we were already closed. And yes, we tried to reopen the restaurants and we had to close them again, actually. And I can tell you about that. But in many ways, it was easier for us because things were already quite quiet and we just continued to stay pretty closed and there weren't that many people around. And I think around the world now in the West, people have already started their year. They were already 2 months into their year plan and they were just getting momentum. And now they've had this sudden and abrupt, like just a huge closing of the doors and of commerce. And so I think that must be a lot more jarring for them. Whereas for us, it was pretty, it was already low key and it just stayed pretty low key for us.
Yeah, I think you just explained it quite well. Because the way I was observing it here from America was it just like, oh, they're extending Chinese New Year for a week. It's quite simple to just kind of extend it. And it almost downplays the seriousness of the whole situation, which was confusing because it's like, oh, we're just extending Chinese New Year by a week, but in reality, it's a huge deal to do that. But it didn't seem like it because it's just extending a holiday. It was just terribly interesting timing for all of that to happen. So let's kind of dive into your experience where, you own a couple restaurants and businesses, and that must have been quite the experience to not be allowed to open up.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a crash course in being flexible and, working with local authorities. We had reopened. So I guess the whole chronology, and I won't go into detail, but the bird's eye view is that we reopened all the shops as we had originally planned around the 31st of Jan. So I think because we didn't know the seriousness, as you say, it was part of the new year and, we thought that it would be contained faster or that it wasn't as extreme. We reopened everything as we had planned. And then over the course of the next week, 2 weeks, each region, so all of the districts in Shanghai, which are the different neighborhoods, they were all legally forced to close all of the restaurants and other businesses that had high traffic in different stages. The tricky thing was the 4 restaurants that I have, there are 3 different regions, so 3 different districts. And so each district behaves so differently. And even within the districts, it was different street to street.
Wow.
And so China has this amazing system of controlling things, which is how it moves so quickly and with such a strong arm because it breaks down each city into a district into a community to a street, and they have different authorities for each of these levels. So we were getting different information every day from, different people who are connected to our area and connected to the shops. So it was kind of tough to keep up with each detail as it was introduced, but we tried our best, and all in all, we lost around 14 to 20 days per shop in trading. And then when we reopened, one of the districts said, okay, you're totally fine. Just take the temperature of people as they walk in. The next district said, you're okay to reopen, but you can only stay open until 8 p.m. And the other one said, oh, you can stay open until 10 p.m., but you can only have alcohol between 8 and 10 p.m. and only food until 8 p.m. And then you have to have a meter between each person. And it was just such a big range. And so for me, it was kind of exhausting, but also, a really good lesson to try to keep up with all these different jurisdictions and authorities as they came by.
Wow. A logistical nightmare, but it sounds like you juggled it quite well.
trying. Such a good team. They were all so amazing with keeping up. So
Yeah.
it was challenging for sure, but interesting.
I was I think you might know Sam from Shime.
Of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I was kind of talking to him a little on and off, and this was back in January. There was just, or early February, I guess, and it was kind of a discussion. I mean, at that time, it seemed insane that they were closing restaurants. Now it doesn't seem insane, but at the time, it seemed
Right.
wild that they were just forcing businesses to not operate. And I was almost asking
Yes.
him, like, is there a potential for the government, helping you guys stay afloat financially? Like, is that in the talks? He said it was like somewhat of a discussion, but I was curious at that time when you were potentially losing a lot of money, was it in your head or was it just kind of like, I don't know, what was going through your head financially?
That's a great question. I think the one thing that China is amazing at is that it really supports the people who are here.
Hmm.
It's such a strong arm state and it's such a controlling state. But the flip side of that is that it needs to be responsible for us, even in times of need. And so I think it was amazing about being communicative with us, releasing information as quickly as possible. Yeah, sometimes the information was contradictory when you're on a local level, but they did release tons of different measures. They have something that was, published in Shanghai very, very early on called the 28 measures,
Hmm.
which they had thought exhaustively about all the ways in which they could help businesses as they closed. So that runs the gamut from everything to ensuring that your rent is, again, ensuring may be a strong word, but helping to try to cover you if your rent is by a government owned enterprise, all the way through to like profit tax, reducing profit tax, postponing all of our payments for all of our welfare for staff. They really thought deeply about all these things. So I was actually really impressed by all the ways in which they tried to help.
Hmm.
So some of these obviously didn't come to fruition, but so far I've had some help with the taxes, some help with the rents. The one major difference I'm seeing between China and my friends overseas is that all of them they have employees who are at will. And so the second they thought about closing, they just immediately let all of their team go.
Hmm.
Whereas we would get heavily penalized if we let any of our teams go. And so, obviously, as an employer, that's a really tough pill to swallow. But as an employee, I think that they did an amazing job ensuring that people felt confident and that they had some sort of a relief that they weren't just going to lose everything because people felt pressure.
Hmm. That's an amazing answer to what was going to be my next question.
Sorry.
How different cultures are handling this pandemic. Um, I mean, yeah, in America, I have so many friends that like, some of them are waiters or waitresses or, they work in the restaurant industry and they just got let go flat out, like so quickly, just
Yeah.
dropped. And even my brother who works at the airport, it's a little bit more of a stable situation, but they're in the process of furloughing people. So they're starting out by
Mm,
voluntarily like giving people the option to furlough. And then after that, it's just going to be like kind of mandatory. So what I'm seeing
yeah.
is such a different way of handling this situation from what you just described, what China's doing. And to my understanding, it's just kind of like people are, they respect authority in China, so they're going to listen to what's happening. And it it just seems like it was so much more of a smooth thing from the way that you're describing compared to what I'm currently experiencing right now. It's March 29th or March 30th in New York. But yeah, I guess if you have anything else to touch on about the differences in cultures, I was fascinated. I didn't really understand that in China everyone is not at will, or maybe you could talk a little bit more about that for your employees.
Sure. I mean, I think going back to the bigger picture, I think
Mm,
that there is, people here ultimately we're in a country with communistic government structure, and therefore the employee and the worker, the citizen is always protected.
mm,
And so in times like this, that's a really valuable thing. And I think because it's such a controlling government, people have respect and some would say fear, but I think mostly respect for and trust in the government.
mm,
And so you see people just automatically obeying because they know that if the government is making decisions, it is for the greater good. And the thing that I kept thinking about, being an American myself, and it's terrible to say now, and I feel bad even sharing this, but back while this was happening in Feb, I kept thinking about, if this happened in America, people would just laugh when someone tried to take their temperature walking into a mall, or if they were told to stay home. Like America, we have this sense of, and we're born with these quote unquote innate rights, right? Like personal rights that no one can impede upon unless it's a legal setting. So I just kept thinking the fact that people would not obey government rules or regulations as they were published because there's no sense of the collective. Here, people peer pressure each other into doing the right thing, whatever that may be, and whatever that perception is. So it was amazing to see that the second things were published that we should stay home and distance, wear masks, whatever else. I mean, people give you a dirty look on the street if you're not wearing a mask, and they might even yell at you if you try to enter a building without one. In America, I feel like it took them a long time to realize the gravity of the situation. So that's been a really interesting thing.
I can
from afar, from what I can tell.
I can definitely confirm your suspicions. I mean, it was early to mid March, just a couple of weeks ago. I was playing softball across the street before it got like very serious with the social distancing, and my friends who just kind of never left Long Island, they have that same mentality. They're talking about potentially like the National Guard coming in and giving orders, and their first thought is like, oh, if this is like, no one's going to listen to that. Like, it's going to be a joke. Like, there's going to be riots. Like, you can't tell us what to do. And you're exactly right. And I agree with you that that's unfortunately the mindset and kind of the culture of America, like very individualistic. Like, we have these innate rights and, the government is against us. That's just not true. They're trying to do what's right for us, but there seems to always be this like, I want to go like head to head for some reason. That's just the way it is, and that's why I totally think China had the upper hand culturally, being able to handle a pandemic like this
in this scenario. Yeah, definitely. And I think neither one is right or wrong. It just happens to be the way it is, and so we definitely see the advantages to a more controlled society in situations like this.
Very well said.
In terms of like the employees, I think it's been so funny because for me, I've actually never worked in hospitality in America or in Europe. And so I actually prepared a pack of best practices of things that myself and a bunch of friends and I who are in hospitality have learned through the COVID situation. And I started messaging people and sending it out to all the hospitality people I knew who are in the West. And so for me, it's actually been such a crash course in learning because some people have given me feedback like, this is relevant, this isn't very relevant. And so I think that it seems like the Scandinavian countries, some of them are help supporting the workers, that they're paying a minimum wage or something. In China, in addition to ensuring people don't get fired, they've also released certain social support systems, like their their benefits that they pay into, almost like a social security. So they have released a certain amount per person that they can access from the social security that they've been paying. So they can take up to 6,000 RMB from their housing fund, and then up to 800 per person, just generally as a citizen of China. And that's been amazing. And so it seems like Scandinavian countries followed suit with that. But places like America, where you have at-will employment, people just let go because employers think, oh, it's better for them. They can just go claim unemployment. Well, how many people do you think are claiming unemployment right now? How quickly do you think those payments can be made? In a country with such poor infrastructure, like who's going to see $1 within the next however many months? And that doesn't even start touching on our, challenged healthcare systems. So it's really tricky for me to look back at the West, and my only hope is that we can see this as really uncovering all of the issues that we have with our infrastructures, and hopefully we can use this as a learning, and that we can repair the issues that we have. But I think that that's very optimistic, especially in an election year.
Yeah, so many things to unpack there. It does seem like an opportunity to almost hit a reset button somehow in like the most ideal of
Yeah,
situations, even though like that just won't happen. But it does put things into perspective, when you go through a
for
situation
sure.
like this. It just feels like people compare it to 9/11. It just feels like this whole like paradigm shift of how the world will be after, you know.
Definitely.
It's yeah, so speaking of kind of the media, I guess, what were your thoughts on how the media handled the situation? I guess you spent the entire time in China, is that right? You didn't leave?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. I was here the whole time. I
Yeah,
really want to take a holiday right now.
I bet you do.
I'm so jealous. Everyone posting pictures from Bali, like, oh, Corona refugee. I'm like, shut up.
I mean, it's nice, but at the same time, like I can't even come back into Shanghai right now. I'm just not like they
Yeah.
put a ban on entry for a temporary period of time.
Yes.
So, I
Very
mean,
extreme measure.
I'm
Yeah.
on vacation in New York, but not really. Like quarantine life is not as glamorous as you
Forced
think.
vacation.
Yeah, forced
Yeah,
vacation.
true.
But anyways, the media here just felt overwhelming almost all the time. Like there's a balance between giving you information and then like fear mongering. So I was wondering what your
Right.
experience was like in China.
I think it's such an interesting question because it's also such an interesting juxtaposition of the two countries. Here in China, the media is so controlled. And therefore, we would see dispatches, daily, just what the government wanted us to hear. And that obviously can be a very good thing and a very bad thing. So, on the good side, they had an aligned message. Everything was very clear, well, as clear as it can be in politics speak.
Mhm.
But they put out the information that everyone would get at once, and then we were all aligned. On the flip side of that is obviously that they do have control, and so there have been questions how transparent numbers have been in terms of number of cases and deaths and so forth. But for the most part, I would like to say that I do trust them to help control the social dynamic so people don't panic. I think people here were less anxious because everyone was getting the same message, and it was more, I guess, streamlined in that way. They
Mm,
even go onto social media, and if anyone's posting things that aren't necessarily endorsed by the government, that they can control that as well.
mm,
So that seems super extreme to people living in the West, of course. But at the same time, it does feel like everyone is on the same page and no one is freaking out at the level that I've seen and heard from friends back in the States. So just seeing all of the Western media, most people forget that media is a business. You're trying to sell something. You're trying to sell a headline, a hit on a website, a click through, whatever it is. And so, of course, they're going to make it seem more sensationalized than it needs to be. And so that actually, it made me very thankful in many ways to live here because their whole thing is about social harmony and calming everyone, uniting everyone. Whether or not that's artificial is one thing, but at least people didn't lose their heads. Everyone I talked to back in the West seems to be panicking, and that's really scary. It's not, there's a certain point at which emotion takes control because there's nothing you can do about this except for staying home, washing your hands, all of those. Like after that, it's really, it's a little bit tricky. So, yeah, it's been really crazy to see the difference in the two. The one thing that I think is really sad is that the West used this virus to sensationalize and even show racism towards China in a way that to me was totally unjustified. And they actually lost such valuable time to prepare and to honor the severity of this disease. Like the New York Times op ed about this is basically that the US squandered 2 good months that they could have used to prepare. Instead, they just, I don't know, exhibited xenophobia and called it some Chinese disease that people should just, I just felt like it was such a sad missed opportunity. And it's said much better than I could ever say it in that op ed. I can't remember who wrote it. I should try to figure that out and send it to you
mm.
later.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes. That'd be interesting to read.
Yeah.
I mean, thank you so much for your perspective. I agree on quite a few things you said, especially just like talking about the media and how it's somewhat controlled. It's like a double-sided coin, two-sided coin, however we want to
Mhm.
say it. And it seems like I'm sided with China a lot, but in this case, I think control, like if you grant or assume they're going to be doing the right thing morally, or just put out the positive, correct information. Like, it just makes total more sense to have just a very clear message, which I think is what China did very well. So let's end this on, actually, I wanted to say one other thing. I've been reading a lot how there's actually some xenophobia towards foreigners now in America in China, because of, that's just what I've been reading. Like, there's signs saying no foreign friends welcome at our gym and stuff like that. And I don't know how sensationalized that it's been on WeChat, or if you've seen any of those posts, but I was wondering if you could comment on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen the tenor shift from in January, February. It was more about Waidiren, like people who are not from Shanghai, the returning Chinese people who've been traveling around the country, for them bringing it back from wherever they've been. So back then, I think in the beginning of this, it was much more anti-outsider Shanghainese people, people from outside of Shanghai, because everyone was traveling so much. So people didn't regard me as a visible foreigner, shall we say, someone of Caucasian appearance. Yeah. People didn't look at me any differently. I was kind of under the radar. I have definitely felt a shift recently with the fact that, the situation in Italy and the US and the UK seems to be very bad. Recently, there has been more focus on foreigners and the fact that they might be bringing that back as they return to China to start work. So I haven't seen, in person, I have not seen any of those signs. I think there might have been one that went viral, but yeah, I don't think it's as bad as the media makes it seem, but I do think that there is more awareness of the people who have come back from abroad. So they're taking the quarantine situation way more seriously. Almost every single person who enters the country, before the 28th, had to go straight to a hotel and do a 2-week quarantine.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're not messing around. It's serious business.
Yeah. I have, Gustav, maybe Gustav, he's in Taiwan, and I'm going to talk to him soon. He had a very interesting, he's sent some photos on Instagram. They actually gave him a phone. They gave him like a Samsung phone, and we're checking in. Like, the government issued this phone to check in with him like twice a day, take his temperature. Taiwan apparently handled this the best out of many entities around the world.
China's going all out. It's pretty, I think all of these countries here are just so paranoid. Like, people have been put in these hotels, or if they go back to their homes, there's a man in a bus driving them with 2 guys in hazmat suits. The bus driver and the guys in hazmat suits apparently have to go on quarantine after they make the trip. So they're sending each person home in an individual bus with 3 people who then have to go into quarantine before they can do anything else. And then they put an electric sensor on your door so that they can monitor you going in and out. Like, the amount of cash and human resource that they're expending on each person is so mind-blowing. It's crazy.
Yeah, pretty incredible. I even heard one story about someone who broke their quarantine to go on a run and got deported.
Oh, no way. Yeah. Wow. That's extreme. Very extreme.
Yeah, pretty crazy. So I think we can end on a good note. I want to tell me one more time about your new adventure into drinks. What is it again?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so it's going to be called Lucky Mart, and it's going to be a highball bar in Konbini on Fuminlu between Julu and Hanglalu, and we're going to open next week.
Wow.
So we'll see.
Yeah, I wish I could be there. I will come as soon as I'm allowed to re-enter the country.
Yes, petition the guys. We need you in here. Try some highballs.
Camden, thank you so much for your time. Hope to see you soon.
Great to speak. You too. Come back soon.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Boom, that's it. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this podcast valuable, there are many ways you can support it. The best way is by going to my website, observingtheprocess.com. For just $5 a month or $50 for the year, you can become a monthly supporter. This show relies on listener support to stay on the air, so if you find this content valuable, I hope you will consider subscribing. You can find a link to subscribe in the description of this podcast. If you can't support monthly, no worries. You can help out by rating and reviewing on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. You can share it with your friends, you can blog about it, or discuss it on your own podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you for supporting the show. Listeners like you make it possible. If you are looking for information on how to protect yourself and stay safe from COVID-19, please get information from the CDC or the World Health Organization. Also, if you enjoyed the intro and outro music, it was made by my brother, Danny Greenberg. You can go and check out his beats on Apple Music, Spotify, YouTube, or SoundCloud. He goes by the name Estoric, Estoric. All right, that's it for now.
This podcast was recorded on March 30th, 2020.